right. Well, hey, I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, Spiritual Care in an Age of Social Distancing. You know, we've been doing this webinar series through the Kairos Network, Church Planning Network, and one of our goals was to help you as church leaders through a really challenging time, unprecedented time, really, in our church's history, as we seek to. Sorry, I was looking at Bruce there. I love that. This is one of the reasons I'm really excited about this group. I think we're going to have some fun today. And I'm really excited about today's topic because, selfishly, for me personally, spiritual care is always an area I feel like I have to work at. And so you add in the challenge and the obstacles of social distancing and not being able to go in to hospitals and not being able to do just the normal spiritual care we were all taught. It becomes a big challenge. So that's why I'm so excited that we've brought these guys together. I'd like to introduce you, who was wearing the mask earlier, Mr. Bruce Hartung, the Dr. Bruce Hartung. I've known Bruce since I was in seminary. He's been a huge help to me, and a lot of what I know about spiritual care comes from Bruce. So Bruce, thanks for taking the time to join us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
And thank you for bringing the mask too. That's
It's how we look when we leave our space. It's a requirement where we live.
Oh man, yeah, because you're in DC now, correct?
Mm-hmm. At a adult community.
Oh wow, it's amazing. Dr. Rick Mars, thank you for joining us. Rick was he was a young gun professor when I was in seminary,
Yeah.
one of the new counseling professors, and I just always really appreciated his take on counseling and some of the skills he taught me. I'll never forget when it comes to counseling. So thank you for joining us today.
Very good to be with you.
And then Pastor Jeff Cloeter, you have been in St. Louis since I was in seminary as well. I think you had just started Reliant when I was in seminary through Christ Memorial. And now you're over Reliant and then also over Christ Memorial. And you're just one of those guys that's just great at being a pastor. I love the blog you put together, and some of the things that you've been sharing in this season on that blog have been tremendously helpful. So I really appreciate you taking time to join us.
Thanks, Matt. And call day is coming up for a lot of guys, and it always brings me back to my call day. And I thought I would be 3 and out in my first call, but here I am like 15 years later. So to any seminarians tuning in, it could be a long haul. But Matt, I want to thank you for having us, and Bruce and Rick, it's great to be with you.
That's awesome. Well, hey guys, I think one of the reasons this is such an important topic is because John 13, Jesus says, they will know you are my disciples by your love for one another. And I think the way that we care for each other within the church, not only does that bleed out into the community, but it really is the picture to the community of what it means to be a Christian. And I know that in this season, there's a lot of pressure on how we care. So I wanted to kick off our conversation today and just ask you guys a simple question. I've been told that spiritual care begins with self-care. And in the midst of a crisis, I think self-care is a really challenging thing. So what are some things we need to keep in mind in the midst of a crisis when we're trying to care for ourselves as well as those around us?
A couple of weeks ago, well, not a couple weeks, probably about a month ago, when this all started to happen, a pastor friend of mine, Dave Lewis, was prophetic in some of the stuff that he told me and some other pastors. He did disaster response in the Southern District right after Hurricane Katrina. Mm. And so he kind of had been through trauma and a disaster. And he said, guys, just take care of yourselves. He said, I'm still recovering 15 years later from Katrina. Mm. And then he said, one thing that I learned in disaster response is that you can't fix everything. And that has been kind of haunting to me as I try to navigate this for myself. I went through about 2 weeks early on of just kind of anxiety because I felt useless and helpless as a pastor. And his words to me were really helpful because it reminded me that I can't fix everything. I want to control things. And that was my anxiety from that. but that there is a sense of kind of, for the pastor or the church worker, of kind of confession of our own maybe obsession at that time, and that's part of self-care, I think.
Oh, that's huge. I had a mentor, Greg Burse. We were in a very high impact ministry. In fact, my first month of ministry was during the swine flu epidemic, and really walked through some challenges with that. And I remember him sitting me down saying, Matt, sometimes you just have to take the S off your chest because you can't be the savior.
There are lots of things that S could stand for that you need to take off your chest. So, but I can't say some of them in a conference like these. I think for me, I think it's important, and I can only speak for my own experience in this. It's important to begin to assess what it is that you're lost and need to grieve. In order to be able to have a sense of what's important in things. As a for instance, we all know that the natural human tendency in a disaster is to look toward others and actually to begin to gather in community. What we've got, however, is a virus that demands us to do the opposite. And that is to stay away. So instead of turning toward, which is what we would ordinarily do, we are in a process of needing to turn away. And the implications of that are, I believe, profound. So the ministry question has to do, at least for me, with how it is, and the self-care part of it, is how is there enough turning toward, how is there enough connection, even though we're not connecting in the usual ways that we connect. Here, for instance, we are prohibited from being together more than 3 in a place. Maryland is 10. All community activity is off. The question of human connectedness is really vital. And for self-care and for the immune systems of caregivers, the connectivity to people in one way or another is really crucial. So we know that loneliness and isolation causes the immune system to decrease. So the process is that your tendency in this is going to be more open to illness. And so part of it is the reconstruction of connectedness. So I guess that's a very long response to your short question. Sorry about that, Matt, but you know I do that from time to time.
No, that's good.
Which is essentially, hey, look, where are your connections? What do you need as a human being? And in what ways in this time, very different time, to stay connected to others so that you are sustained interpersonally. And that also means in the body of Christ, sustained by Jesus' presence and the presence of being with Christ's followers. It's a difficult question, but I think it needs to be engaged and utilized. Like, who are you connecting with and who gives you nourishment?
Yeah, and to the panel, what are some of those critical relationships that we should be leaning into in this season?
To back up and do a little bit more on the self-care, again, I'm encouraging people to make sure they're taking physical care of themselves as well. You can't do some of the things. My typical exercise of going down to the Metropolitan Square building and climbing 40 stories over and over again has been closed down to me because the fitness center in that building is closed down. But I'm finding other ways to get, over 10,000 steps a day, actually over 15,000 steps a day, and some other ways to get some other exercise. And I guess some of the seminarians I've talked to said, yeah, we're at least better able to take care of ourselves now by going out and walking with friends 6 feet away, having some social connection, even when they do that physical exercise, even though there's so many gyms and other sorts of things that have been closed down. So What was your next question then, Matt?
Yeah, no, and I think to your point on exercise, I think, something to keep in mind, especially because I love doing CrossFit, and clearly all the weights aren't going to be available
Right.
in this season. So they've found some great body weight stuff to do. And I think just their idea was, look, something is better than nothing. And it might not be your norm, but just do something. Because especially I spent about 4 weeks by myself, because 2 days before this all broke out, my family took what was supposed to be a 1-week trip to Florida, which extended into 4 weeks. And so post Easter, I'm actually able to be here in Florida and be with them for a while, working remotely. But those 4 weeks, if I didn't exercise, the loneliness would just creep in. So I want to encourage you guys, do like Rick's saying, do something.
Yeah.
And then the other question to you guys was, relationships are important. What are some of the critical relationships that we should be fostering in this season to help us as spiritual caregivers?
Well, I kind of follow with your own board of elders. How are they taking care of themselves? Are they reaching out? Have you set up some sort of way where they're doing some pastoral care in your stead, because you can't go out and phone call or do this kind of video connection with everybody? But who are the spiritual caregivers in your congregation, and can you take care of them as well as try to take care of some of the other people? Like you said, I can't imagine how frustrating it is for parish pastors right now not being able to go to hospitals or nursing homes and try to visit those people by phone. Or, I mean, how many nursing home residents have this kind of capacity to do video chat? I'm not sure.
For me, I'm just trying to lean on the relationships that I've always had.
Right.
I kind of have an inner circle that I lean on. And so one of those I call the garage band, and it has nothing to do with music. None of us play instruments, but we meet in a garage and usually drink beer. So the garage band is getting together tomorrow night at 8:00 on Zoom. And that's just critical to me. It's brotherhood. It's, Martin Luther once said, it's dangerous to be alone. And so I have to watch it that I'm not alone. If I'm going to provide care for other people, I've just got to tap into that network that is sort of the embodied word of God for me. And that's some brotherhood. It's my family. So I have 4 kids and a wife, and I have plenty of connection just in my house. So just our time together, being patient with each other, caring for each other, that's a blessing to me as much as it can be annoying sometimes. But we're caring for one another too. But just at the heart of it, I've got to watch myself right now. I do have a counselor, and I think I'm scheduled next week to talk to him. So I can easily overlook my own care. So I'm grateful for people that kind of poke at me to make sure I'm doing okay.
That's huge.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think too, what I would dovetail off you guys is keep in mind, I think too, the nature of your relationship, because I try to make sure in a season where, some of you guys are in the senior pastor role, which means you may have great relationships with your staff, but they're still your staff and they need something special from you in this season. And so I think making sure you have spaces where you don't have to be Pastor Matt. And I did what you did. I've got a group of friends from college, and we did a social happy hour one night, and it was the most filling thing ever, just doing that through FaceTime. And so I'd encourage you guys, find those spaces where you don't have to be your primary vocation. You can just be you, and you can be encouraged. And then the other thing I've really leaned into is I actually leaned into my staff and let them care for me as well. Because I'm not the one. I felt like at first leaving to be with my family would be like ditching out my church when they need me most. And I needed people around me to say, nope, you're caring for us. Let us care for you. So I think that's huge. And before we jump off this topic of self-care, which we don't want to, I know some guys are thinking, let's move into how we care for the congregation, but I think self-care is important. Yeah. Is there anything else that you all would add that have been critical for you in this season of self-care?
Well, I think what's been mentioned, I think just needs an underlining, which to me has to do with, assumedly, folks have developed a sensitivity to their own nourishment and self-care in the course of their ministry development and their development as leaders. A crisis doesn't change that. So the creativity comes in how do we keep going with the kinds of things that have been useful and helpful to us, and not just abandon them because they're difficult to deal with, or we have we have to develop new ways to deal with them. So Jeff, if your therapist, going to your therapist now by teletherapy is an option, or I was a spiritual director, telemetrically or whatever that is, or exercise or walking or group Bible study with people that you know electronically. That is to identify the kinds of things that have been important and be able to maintain them consistently, even though they are in a different form and maybe a little less satisfying. But maybe not, maybe they are satisfying, but to be able to do that and to pay attention to what you need. Taking the S off your chest, if it is actually Superman, really has to do with, okay, we're all needy here. And we all long for certain kinds of relational and activity sorts of things that nourish us and have nourished us in our life. So it's up to us, I think, to take the initiative in finding them and developing them and keeping them going. Prayerfully, of course, and with the Spirit's guidance, but to stay with what's been good for you.
That's huge. That's huge. So let's take a minute now and let's start moving into care for the congregation, because I know that's the burden on a lot of people's minds that are, into this webinar right now. And in fact, guys, if you have thoughts or questions, you can feel free to share it in the chat, or you can write in the Q&A if you have questions specific for the panelists, and we will address those questions. We want this to be an opportunity for us to have a conversation. So feel free to do that, and we'll do the best we can to keep up with the chat and the panelists. But, the big question we have is caring for people when you can't be in the same room. What are some of the strategies that we should be putting in place to be able to start caring for people when we can't be in the same room? Are there systems that you kind of integrated to make sure that spiritual care is happening more intentionally via distance? What are you all doing?
Hey, Jeff, I think this is yours.
All right, throw me the lob.
Well, or Matt should answer his own question.
Yeah.
In terms of the two active pastors and who are heading parishes of this foursome of us. I mean, I think we'll probably have some ideas, but you all are in the midst of doing it. So I'm going to turn this around to both of you. Come on, talk to us about what you think. At a distance, I am impressed and stunned with the amount of creativity that I see people doing in relationship to doing pastoral care and spiritual leadership of both themselves and the people that surround them in their teams or in their parish life. It's amazing to me what I see, that the crisis has actually developed some ideas about doing things that maybe you didn't have time for or whatever. And so
what have been some of the most surprising, Bruce, as you're watching out? What have been some of the most surprising things you've seen from the field?
Well, for me, see, this is not good, Matt. I just gave you back a question, and you're giving it back to me. I don't know how that's supposed to go. Well, one is pastors resurrecting pastoral visits via telephone or Skype
Yeah.
I've had several folks that I talked to who pulled out the congregational directory and without regard, these are smaller parishes, but maybe under 120 or something, but without regard to whether or not they've been in church, if they're on the record, pick up the phone, call them up and say, hey, we're in the midst of a virus-caused crisis. How are you all doing? That is to open the conversation that maybe hasn't been opened because of time, institutional necessity, and all kinds of other things. Now you've got an opportunity to make that kind of personal contact. And the feedback in relationship to that, at least that I've heard people get, is extraordinary. Folks who haven't been to church in 3 years get a call from their pastor saying, how are you doing in this crisis? And the conversation has an opportunity to move somewhat deeper into that. So that's one of the more surprising things. The other one, of course, is what people are doing for worship. I mean, holy mackerel, I heard, Jeff, that you all, see, this is what you should talk about. And I don't know who our audience is, so they might be, so you might not. Tell us what you did for Easter.
For Easter, well, a lot of churches did this. Some of them, I think, in Mississippi got arrested for doing this, but we did a drive-in service because we have a massive parking lot that can be a liability sometimes, but here it was an opportunity. And I tell you, it goes back to the connectivity point, Bruce, you made earlier. In a time when we really need to be more connected, we're being forced apart. There's a computer scientist in my congregation who said years ago there was a study done about technology, and it said the more high-tech a society is, the more high-touch it needs to be. So we're working with that principle, high-tech, high-touch, and doing both. And so how do we create more touches? And so, yeah, one of them is just phone calls. We're calling every member. Now we've got somewhat of a large congregation, so we've divided that up, and everybody's getting a call. We've identified 421 people that are in a more vulnerable category, and they're getting like 2-3 times a week called. Our Easter service was a drive-in radio frequency, people pull in their cars, and I tell you, it was really weird. I was super nervous about it. The weather was kind of iffy, but the connectivity was a chance for me to see people through a windshield. And people were crying, like just tears, being able to see, especially some of our widows. They're by themselves in their car. And you imagine that's the way they are at home too. For a month, they've just been by themselves. And they roll down their window and I'm just waving as they drive by and they're weeping just for that human contact. And so we're trying to say, how many different ways can we have that kind of a touch with people? And certainly, like phone is an obvious one. And something that I think is cool too is this is really unleashing the mobilizing God's people to do care. So it's not just me. And so yesterday I found out I kind of make random calls. So we have a system where everybody's getting a call. Then I'm free to kind of call as I want, whoever I want. And so I call Margie, and Margie tells me about somebody that she was calling named Elliot, who's a college student. Elliot got the virus. I didn't even know that. He got it 3 weeks ago and now he's recovered. I had no idea, but Margie knew. And at first I'm like, dang, why didn't I know that? I'm the pastor. I should know who in my congregation. And then I thought, no, that's beautiful. Margie knew. And Margie called him and wrote him. And so for me, I think that's just an unintended consequence of this is the mobilization of God's people to be the church and do ministry themselves.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up, Jeff, because, it doesn't just have to be a bigger parish thing. I think a lot of pastors sometimes feel a pressure if they're not the one that physically reached out, and that's only sustainable to a point. And it doesn't have to be a large parish to make that unsustainable in a season like this. But, I noticed the exact same thing you found was that people just cared that somebody from the church called, whether it was one of our elders, whether it was somebody else on staff. And when I called, it was just as helpful, but just as happy hearing from somebody else. As long as there, I think, is a system in place to make sure we're connecting with people, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I like them. I'm looking at the webinar chat too from Brett, sending out a packet of bulletins, prayers, devotionals, and so forth to people in their congregation, just so they know that, hey, you are still present with them as their pastor. You probably heard Bruce and I say in class a number of times, ministry of presence, ministry of presence. It's just so frustrating that you can't feel physically present. Although, yeah, like Jeff's story of the parking lot was just incredible. But people will remember what you pastors and church workers do during this particular crisis. I was a parish pastor during 9/11, and the big issues that came up there was just what's going to happen to our country and so forth. And just being able to address those in that first week or two were extremely important. This is obviously going on much longer than what 9/11 handcuffed us. So.
That's so true. And I think too, the thing I'm hoping in spiritual care is what you guys have highlighted, that we don't lose that raising up God's people to do the work of ministry. Mm-hmm. Like, if in 3 months, 6 months, whenever we get back to the new quote unquote normal, if it goes back to, oh yeah, the pastor does all that ministry stuff again, I'll feel like we lost an opportunity. Granted, it was a terrible situation to have an opportunity out of, but it's been amazing to me just realizing the spiritual care we can give by connecting people that can give care to people that need care. One of the big things we've done is we've started Bethlehem Delivers, because a lot of the food delivery stuff, even in a place like New Jersey where we have that stuff in abundance, is booked out a month. And we have people in our church that can't get groceries or medication and stuff like that. They're high risk, can't get out. We have other people in our church that can easily get out to a grocery store. And so we just one of our college students helped us connect the two. So she built simple Google Forms, and you can sign up to volunteer. You can sign up to receive, and they do PayPal or cash or check. And, we helped connect people that can help to people that can't. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities like that as well in your church, like who can help and who needs the help, and just almost be like the matchmaker, for lack of a better term.
I'm not a very good one to do these things, but you all are, I think. So here's a note about preaching. I think what you can give during this time is to pay attention to people's experiences in whatever version of separation they experience. That's one thing that calling people will get you, as you've already mentioned, Jeff, in terms of learning something about what's going on. If you begin to get a flavor of what people are experiencing, you can enter, in some cases, that darkness or that difficulty. People are going to experience this in different ways, but it's a struggle for most of us. You experience this, and then you speak into that experience, really paying attention to your own experience as well. What I'm concerned about is when preachers ignore the reality of what people are in and just sort of do I hope this won't be censored, Matt, but just do sort of a flat Bible study without regard to the fact that people are walking through an experience, or a sermon that has no connection, particularly with the fact that we're really fairly isolated in different spots in the country, but New York, New Jersey, Maryland, DC, we're quite isolated. And so are the California, the coast folks and whatever, and anybody who's in a stay-at-home state. So find out what it is that is their experience, so that you have an opportunity to hear from them what it's like, and then begin to speak to it in your teaching and preaching. So I wouldn't think a sermon would ever be without some reference to people's experience in the pandemic.
Yeah.
I
can't go back to the high-tech, high-touch thing. Matt, another webinar you did was with Pavla and Popovits. And I thought that was really helpful, how to use technology, whether it's preaching or worship, but to do it in ways that are human. And I think that's kind of what Bruce is saying too. Just be a human being. You know, if you're a pastor or a church worker, like now's the time to just be superhuman, if that sounds kind of odd, but like even now, like there were a couple of just really basic things that were helpful for me, like eye contact, like looking into the camera is so critical. That's part of pastoral care. That's just like looking at people, acknowledging that they exist. People want to be seen and be known. That's a fundamental thing. And we believe that of God, that he sees us and knows us. And so in as much in our pastoral or our care of people, if we can just see them and know them and use everything in the arsenal that's possible to be superhuman in that way.
That's an important piece. That's good shrink language, Jeff.
Uh-oh.
Sorry about that. Well, I talked about preaching. You can talk about shrink stuff. But what some of the people are telling us about all this is that in electronic stuff, eye contact, you don't have touch and you don't have smell, but you do still have eye contact. And so how you even set your camera to be able to look into the camera rather than looking out or something, because that the eye contact piece gets certain kinds of endorphins going and inside the body that are really important. So way to go with even, with thinking about that. That's really good news.
And I think
that was the lesson from the Muppets, right? Right, Matt? Was that a lesson from the Muppets? Like,
yeah, Jim Henson. Yeah.
We learn from all places, can we?
Yeah. If you guys are wondering what we're talking about, you can always go to www.lifewithchurchplanner/webinars, and you can catch the on demand as well as this one too. I'm seeing.
Are any of you using written notes of remembrance or?
I haven't used written notes because my handwriting is so awful. It's kind of unloving for me to handwrite a note. But I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I see some people in the chat are talking about that, and I've done that. It's hard to write. I've written notes to my staff, handwritten notes, in my 4th grade handwriting. But that's another way to just be human. And I thought, because I was going to send them an email and just say, hey, I'm proud of you. You're doing a great job. But I realized, like, an email, you discard it. It just ends up in the thousands of other emails you have. So I sent something to mail. I don't know if they got it. I don't know if they appreciate it. I sent it last week. I think they do. But yeah, handwritten notes are good, I think.
I think that's huge. And you guys are posting some great stuff in the chat. I saw using Zoom Bible studies. One of the most impressive things for me in that, spiritual care wise, was our older members caught on to it really quickly and have probably appreciated that more than anything else we're doing, is just being able to connect on Zoom. And we just make sure somebody's on the Zoom chat that knows how to host and make it work well. So that's the easier experience for everybody. But that's been fun because I've gotten to sneak into Bible studies I don't normally get to sneak into, and get to be a fly on the wall and hang out with people. So that's really great. We had one question from Ron before we move into our next topic. Ron Holton asks, what do you do when you call someone to see how they're doing and to offer support, but they don't want to talk?
Don't want to talk.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I mean, that's maybe too flippant. But people have varying responses. There is no one-size-fits-all response to this kind of a disaster event. And some people actually are doing fine, I would, believe it or not, through it. If people don't want to talk, you continue to invite them.
Right.
Well, which is fundamentally, I'm still around and I'd love to talk if you wanna.
Right.
But I want you to know that I'm interested in how you're doing. And I'm wanting to tell you that God walks with you in Jesus.
Yep. Just that simple little thing. I mean, I talked to a pastor the other day who, has some shut-in woman in her 80s or 90s, and he calls her up and he says, "I know it's going to be a 20-second conversation. How you doing, Agnes?" "I'm doing fine." And maybe says a Bible verse or something with her, and that's all Agnes really wants or needs. But she at least knows the pastor is there wanting to connect with her. And if something comes up and she needs to talk to him for 30 minutes next week, well, he's made that offer over and over again. So,
Yeah, you know,
I
and as
always err,
somebody, oh, go ahead, Jeff.
well, I always err on the side of pestering people. So
yeah.
if they don't want to talk, that's fine. But we're gonna err on the side of pestering.
Yeah, and I will tell you too, don't
You know,
underestimate those short moments, because when I was alone at the house, a simple text from somebody saying, "Could I bring you a meal?" Even though I couldn't accept the meal because I had to self-isolate, you know, or just somebody calling to say, "Hey, how are you doing?" It meant the world to me. It was the briefest of interactions, but it made the biggest impact. And so I think just know that when you call, it probably meant something to somebody.
and if you're on a regular piece of following up, the pestering business or whatever, it's kind of like, okay, well, you don't want to talk, but I still am interested in how you're doing. So I'm calling back.
Yeah.
Take the initiative.
Yeah. And even make other suggestions to them. I've been amazed and pleased about the number of elderly people I've spoken with who they're dialing into 2 or 3 or 4 different church services on a Sunday morning. My own mother lives in Kansas. She dials into her own church service. She dials into the church service that my wife and I sing at here in St. Louis, our congregation. And she dials into, I saw my son-in-law, Caleb Cruz, is on this as well. Hi to my grandkids. And she dials into Caleb's as well. So I've heard a number of shut-in people. Well, she's not shut in usually. She's very social, but we're all, I said this the other day, in essence, we're all shut-ins right now. And what can we do to help each other who are shut-ins? And shut-ins have been calling each other on the phone for decades and talking to each other and praying with each other. And so whatever we can do to connect them with other people that are shut in. I was pleased that 2 of my cousins called up my mom to check in on her as well, and thanked them, text messaged them and said, "Thank you for taking care of mom as well. She really appreciated it." So whatever we can do to take care of family, friends, and encourage them to reach out with others. So.
These are brilliant. Before we move into our next topic, because I'm really excited about this next one we're going to talk about, Rick in the chat said, "Which is my priority? Those kinds of pastoral phone calls or writing, producing, recording, editing devotions, worship materials for the whole congregation on the internet." And one of the reasons this sticks out to me is I feel that sense, and I don't want to say how you're feeling, Rick, but I feel that sense of just overwhelmed, of like, now I feel like maybe I have more to do than I did before, and I already felt overwhelmed. Could you guys speak to, I know that one of the reasons we're doing this is just ideas. And so I don't want you guys to think you have extra added on to your already full plate. Right. But how would you guys speak to that question?
Yeah, I can identify with it too, because you're left wondering, am I doing what I'm supposed to do? And then you kind of ask deeper questions. Am I worth anything? Am I worth less just as a pastor? So that goes back to kind of the self-care, just watching yourself and finding support and community. But I think that I have to ask myself again and again, what is it that only I can really do or do well? Like, what do they need me to do more than anything? And I think this gets back a little bit to mobilizing God's people to do ministry. So I'm making calls, but I'm not banking. I don't want the congregation to depend on me to call everybody. Mm-hmm. So there's the system of people. And I think this is a bigger issue that way beyond this, we might learn from this big time. Call day's coming up, and I think Rick, you might know of, there 40 or 50 candidates going out from St. Louis Seminary and then Fort Wayne as well. I think this is advancing the conversation about what is the role of the pastor, especially when you don't have enough pastors or as many. How are we releasing God's people to be the church? Well, this is just forcing us to do it right now. So where can I give permission for God's people to run with stuff and just go with it. And then what do they need me to do that only I could, that they've called me to do? And so it's distinguishing those things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought those up, Jeff. I've got some background noise. I would ask everybody to pray for our graduating classes from Fort Wayne and St. Louis, because yeah, this is just completely changed call day for all of them. They've been feeling some stress. There's been a nice routine now where a specific committee has been identified of students and faculty that are trying to develop strategies to make this a more normal transition for them. But I'm concerned about, all the rest of us had ordination services in the summer after we graduated. They don't know right now if they're going to have ordination services that people can attend. So yeah, pray for this group of that's going out right now, and there will be calls for them all, but it's going to be a very different process for them.
No, absolutely. So here's kind of the topic that I think, I mean, selfishly, it intrigues me the most. In the midst of a crisis, a lot of the cracks we have in our life can become craters. So the marriages that we're experiencing tension, now you start bringing those couples into close quarters for an undefined amount of time. All of a sudden that can start breaking apart. Just a lot of the issues we have can almost be magnified in a time like this. And so it's a really important time for counseling, but how do we do counseling and spiritual care through things like Zoom or FaceTime? And are there any best practices or things we should observe when trying to do counseling through a medium like this?
Professional counselors are doing it all over the United States right now, because obviously they're not able to meet clients, counselees in their own offices. So it's all being done by Zoom or other sorts of things. So just know that it's the new normal, at least for a few months, for not just our profession as pastors and church workers, but for medical doctors are doing a lot of telehealth, but counselors, again, doing a lot of telecounseling. They've been doing some already, but there've been some pushback from the states that you couldn't do telecounseling across state lines because of licensure sorts of things. I think that's been eased up a little bit during this crisis, but yeah, just finding out from that couple, how stressed are they feeling? What are they doing to take care of themselves individually? How can you help them to communicate one to another more effectively? What are their feelings? I mean, you guys both had, or you had us, at least for pastoral care classes, how much we emphasized on reflection of feelings, reflection of emotion words. What are they feeling, and can you guess at what they're feeling at this point as an empathetic attunement sort of thing?
You need to be in a position to know what's going on with them, which gets us back to phone calls and connections, which if you get wind of this, of something going on, that you have an opportunity to respond. The District of Columbia domestic violence groups are overrun now because of the don't leave. That is, domestic violence is on the rise. We do know that the exploitation of kids and kids' availability with kids more on the internet. We do know that attention to explicit sexual material is on the rise significantly. We do know that marital issues that were kind of around because you didn't sign up to be so close with your spouse for so long rise. We know that's all true, and it's going on out there. So how do we get in touch with it? I think by maximizing the sorts of contacts that we have. And then the question is what to do with it. And that becomes a really difficult question, because how do you intervene when you can't go? So it needs to be sort of electronic, or of course, when there is a physical harm, then there are other people that need to get involved. But I think it's more than a technique. It's really first knowing what's going on, and then your inherent capacities to be able to respond empathically to what's happening. That is the beginning, and then you can talk with people about where to go with what it is that with which they're struggling. But in a loneliness environment, one gets even more reinforced that their struggle is they're the only people in the world struggling with with whatever with which they are struggling. And the reality is that we know that there are tons of things that are happening as people are cramped more together.
Now, that's really helpful. And so if, I'm your average pastor when it comes to counseling and stuff like that. So if I'm doing a counseling session via Zoom versus in person, are there some things that are different that I should be aware of in that counseling session versus if I was sitting with somebody kind of in my office? Whether that's, does the length of the session need to be longer or shorter? Should I consider doing more sessions than I would normally do? And then what might be some resources that, because I think every counseling, there's some counseling sessions that will just go beyond what we've been trained for. And so what are some of the best resources we could maybe use or link to in this time to help connect people with the help they may need?
I'll throw out there tomorrow, I'm on the board of directors for Ambassadors of Reconciliation, and Ambassadors of Reconciliation has a lot of great stuff on how to help couples, but also other Christians, other churches reconcile with one another based in the gospel. Ted Kober and Dwight Shetler are actually starting 2 different free webinars tomorrow at their website about personal peacemaking. And so if people want to go and try that, I think that might be a very positive place to go to. Doxology probably has some other stuff on its website. A few years ago, I did a webinar thing for Lutheran Hour Ministries on stress and worry in the life of the Christian. And so they've reinvigorated that, and that's possible to access that through concordiatheology.org or through Lutheran Hour Ministries directly. So as for your direct question about how to, so there's just tons of resources out there that I think can be used if people are willing to hear about how they can be reconciled one to another through ambassadors or deal with their stress and worry and so forth. So, but as for your counseling, in one sense, you're getting to see their house. Maybe you ask them to carry their computer around so you can kind of do a home visit while you're on the computer there with them. I don't know, making sure that you've got some sort of process where if they're not in the same place, if their marriage is fractured so much that one of them is in one place and one of them in another, that you've got at least a Zoom type meeting thing that you can meet with them together like we are here. I know of one counselor who ran into that her particular software only allows her to see 2 people at one time in the same place, and a fractured couple then couldn't come and see her. But Zoom or something like that would allow you to even help bring together 2 couples that aren't, or a couple that aren't even in the same house together. So
that's huge. Bruce, I know you've done quite a bit of Zoom counseling. What are some things you're keeping in mind when you're doing a Zoom or a Skype counseling session?
I'm just learning Zoom, but I do
Skype.
I do a lot of Skype, or Facebook, whatever that is. There's really nothing. There's a disadvantage not being present. So there's some things that just in smell and feel and being in the space of a person, you're not able to assess. Although I really like Rick's idea about having people take you around the home.
Yeah.
That's really quite cool. And it's with a home visit kind of thing. But I think the same parameters, Matt, which is don't shift what you already do in terms of your boundaries. So if your boundaries are time limited, say so and keep them. If you're doing something, if you're into something that is beyond you or I, or beyond what it is that we're equipped to handle, you assumedly already have resources in the community that you access and that you help people move into. You're sort of a triage person in many ways. And you can help people move into a relationship with someone else. Safety becomes critical always. So those sorts of things it's just sort of like you're doing what was within your level, or I am doing what's in my level of skill, basically in the same way that I did it when I was physically present, except there's some things that I can't do. Mm-hmm. And I have a relationship with other folks for referral. I am alert to safety issues. And I work at trying to be as empathic and understanding as I can about what's going on. The other thing that I will add to this, though, is if you know what we're learning about people's regular responses to this kind of sheltering in place or physical distancing, you also have an opportunity to normalize it. If it's not, well, to normalize it by your own experience of what it is that you experience. Pastor, as a for instance, because this is an issue for me, but Pastor, when I wake up in the morning, all of a sudden, I can't remember what day it is. Am I losing my mind? Well, if it's like you, I mean, what I would respond to that is, we share that because my routine is all off. So the routine that helped me define days no longer exists in this kind of a mechanism, So just the connection with, I've heard that a lot from people. Or I just read in the Lutheran Witness or whatever you're reading that this is the experience of people too. So you're joining a lot of folks who are experiencing the same thing. All of a sudden I'm here and I'm in the middle of the day and I feel this overwhelming amount of anger. Oh, well, tell me more. Who of us, well, I don't know about you all, but every once in a while, I just am walking along and I'm thinking, I get angry. What? At God? Gee, I get angry. I'm really feeling angry at God for doing this. Pastor, can you, whatever, and you can respond with a normalization of it, which is in some ways, I mean, not everybody feels this way, but in some ways, well, yeah, because we don't know, there's a kind of a lament. Encourage people to read a couple of the Psalms. Yeah. For instance, join the psalmist in his anger and things like that. But you get a chance to normalize what's going on. I'm a little more edgy with my wife. I mean, that's actually true. Judy will tell you that. I'm a little more, I'm noticing things that I haven't noticed before. And I say, hey, Judy, have you been doing this our entire marriage? And she says, well, yeah, I have. But I said, well, why am I getting irritated at it now? Well, maybe it's because we haven't signed up for being so close together for so long. It's part of the humanization of people's experience so they feel so that they are in fact connected, and also that they are not alone in their experience, which then tends to cause people to pathologize their experience. I'm feeling this, there must be something wrong with me. Everybody else is doing well. I'm having this going on, and there must be something wrong, thus deepening the loneliness or isolation. So, it's that kind of normalization, I think, that makes a ton of sense. That's not directly to your question, though, of what.
No, I think that's a huge point. Just helping people realize that some of those things that don't seem normal are actually normal in the season of crisis that we're in. And before we jump off this, as we get ready to wrap up, Sarah Milan asked, can you expand on what safety issues might look like and what might happen if you run into a mandatory reporting situation?
Well, you mandatory report. But a safety issue might look like my husband is beating me. Or, I get so lonely that I want to take my own life. Or I can't stop my kids from accessing explicit, that's not so much safety, it's safety for them later on, but explicit kind of material. Or my siblings are actually getting more aggressive with each other, more than they usually are. Well, you begin to assess those things. For domestic violence, you would, of course, involve whoever in your community and how they work under these circumstances. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's those kinds of safety questions, which really, or a whole other line that we haven't talked about very much is, I've called my mom and she seems to be not able to pay attention to just doing normal things, and as that there was some indication of not being able to cope anymore. I don't know if that's the intent of. I didn't see the
yeah, I think that's kind of the intent of the question. And if we're mandatory reporting, you'd call people like the local police department, people
suicide,
like that.
Yeah, suicide prevention hotline, get some guidance from them. Domestic violence hotlines, get some guidance from them about if they think this is a
your local mental health
thing.
Community that might have an emergency response group.
This is a really important time, I think, for pastors to connect with the counselors that they normally refer their people to and start consulting with them and asking them advice right now during this crisis. Those people are there to do that. So,
and I think that's huge. And I'll let you guys know, we'll include some specific links, and then in things where it's just something that would be different area to area, we'll just include a term and then Google that term, and you'll generally find those resources in your area pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So kind of the thing I wanted to do to wrap up our time is, what are some of the resources that pastors can turn to in this time to learn to just kind of refresh on spiritual care, or maybe dig a little bit deeper into how they can do crisis care and things like that? Do you all have any resources you've been turning to, or things that you found helpful?
Let Rick sell his book.
I'll at least throw that out there that, if anybody hasn't come across Making Christian Counseling More Christ-Centered, this just got published last fall, and I'm hoping has an influence for Lutheran pastors, but also, the first half of it is kind of Luther soul care theology that a lot of your non-Lutheran Christian counselors don't understand. And so I'm hoping that pastors will loan their copy to their non-Lutheran Christian counselors and ask them to read it so that you can have a follow-up conversation with them about it a month from now or 2 months from now. I don't make a lot of money on this. I'm not making any money on this because the proceeds are going to Ambassadors of Reconciliation and Doxology. at least the royalties and so forth for that. So I hope it's a benefit to the church, and you can find it at westbowpress.com to get that. So if you like digital books, it's only $4.95 as a digital book. So
that's so awesome.
I would suggest, I think back at the beginning, we were talking about just great ideas from other pastors. And so for me, it's networking. I'm tapping all of my networks. We have a strong local community of pastors, and we're really fighting through this together, learning from each other. Because some of it's, we've always done pastoral care in certain ways, but some of it's unprecedented. And so we're kind of pioneering together. And I think that's really important, just to be in touch with others, sharpen our own swords. And there are some who are watching right now that I have talked to, and we learn from each other.
That's huge.
The American Psychological Association has a ton of COVID-19 resources for psychologists, patients, and healthcare providers. You might look that up. That's, well, you can look at American Psychological Association. Or there are just lots of things. American Bible Society has a piece on working through emotions in the COVID crisis. For instance, that might be used. And then I was looking and cannot find Brad. That's a mental health for pastors group. I'll get that along to you, but because he's the one that has been advertising this a little bit. But anyway, but American Bible Society has a curriculum actually on working through emotions. But there are there's a lot of good resources out there in terms of, well, a lot of good resources.
That's huge. That's a huge help. And then, from a leadership perspective, leading your church through this time, I found a lot of help. Carrie Newhoff has a free crisis leadership class. Michael Hyatt has one that's deeply discounted. He kind of dances that line between nonprofit and business, but there was some great stuff in there. And then also the guy that wrote 21 Influential Laws of Leadership. I'll think of his name probably after this webinar. Has released a 3-part webinar series that was really helpful. And now I can physically see his name in my mind, but I cannot make it come to my lips. So that will be on our PDF, I promise you, when we send that out. But guys, thank you so much for taking the time. If it's okay with you all, I'd love to just end with a little prayer, because ultimately the greatest resource we can lean into is the Holy Spirit and one another. So let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to come together. God, I pray that you would bless us. All of us who are watching this on this call together, all of us who are watching it later, God, I pray that you would just fill us with the tools that we need, Lord. Fill us with your presence and your spirit, and just help us as we seek to care for your church, God, and your people in the midst of this time. And may many people see the love that we have for one another, and may they turn to you because of that love. It's in your name, Lord Jesus, by your strength we pray. Amen. Well, guys, thank you so much. If you want to share this out, you can go to www.lifeforchurchplanter.com/webinars and use the same link that you've got to share it out. It'll be available on demand in the next 15 minutes. So, guys, thank you so much, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys next time.
Good to see you all.
Be well.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to see you, Bruce.